My interest in Father Eugene, which you call him here too, that was how he was universally known in Palestine by everybody. It began during my PhD research. I initially started researching the Irish Catholic Church and Zionism in the mid-20th century. And when I was researching that, Father Eugene's name kept coming up, particularly in newspaper articles to do with the holy places in Palestine in the late 1940s, and particularly during the First Arab-Israeli War of 1947 and 1948. And a little digging on him, because I was intrigued as to who this guy was. He was the source of a lot of newspaper articles here about the destruction of the holy places during that war. So a little digging on him, and I discovered that he'd been Catholic chaplain to the British section of the Palestine police. And when I looked into that, I was astonished to discover that there were hundreds of Irishmen serving in the British section of the Palestine police in the 1940s. So I changed the subject of my doctorate to that, the Irish involvement in the policing of the Palestine Mandate. But Father Eugene remained a constant presence in the background of this new research, because he really took a very hands-on approach to his duties as Catholic chaplain. And I discovered also that even outside of that, he was a very significant religious figure and even a political figure in Palestine in the 1930s and the 1940s. I should also say that he was very well known here in Ireland as well, especially as a writer. He published loads of articles on the holy places and other issues in the papers and journals in this country. And he had an international reputation as a scholar as well. In my view, he deserves a full-length biography, and it's my ultimate plan to write it myself. But I have a lot more research to do in that respect, because his surviving papers are very, very sparse. They're in the Irish Franciscan Archive in Killiney. They told me that's what was left in his room in Rome when he died. I don't think that could be true, considering he was such a prolific author and writer, but that's all there is. Everything else seems to be gone in Rome and in Jerusalem. So tonight, I'd just like to provide an outline of my findings on his life thus far, being very conscious that there are most likely people here who know far more about aspects of it than I do, particularly his childhood and his later life, because the archival record is almost silent on that. So I'm going to focus really on his time in Palestine. He arrived there in December 1929, 1931 is my mistake, and he stayed there until Israel was established, then ended up in Jordan and left there, as we'll see, in 1956. So Father Eugene was born as Vincent Hoade on the 30th of March 1903 here in Carnahena House in Headford. By my count in the General Register Office records, he was the 11th of 15 children born to James Hoade and Margaret Curran, who were fairly extensive farmers here, somewhere between 115 and 150 acres. The 1926 census is not very clear on that. The woman here in front is his sister, Sister Jarlath. Four of Father Eugene's siblings took holy orders as well. 3 became nuns, Sister Jarlath being one. She worked on the missions in Sierra Leone and India, and one of his brothers also became a Franciscan. Of Vincent's childhood, I don't know very much at all. He did write a very short account of it in 1929 when he was 26, called Who Am I? And in this, he said he couldn't remember himself very much about his early years, but that he was evidently, in his own words, a very naughty child. In later days, he wrote, older folk knowingly shook their heads and wizenly spoke of the feats of my unregenerate youth. Now, he didn't spell it out, but you get the impression from this short account that he did have a happy childhood, a carefree childhood, and that he felt secure in it. I assume, but I don't know for certain, that he attended the local primary school. But he did then receive his secondary education as what he described in this account. Knockrood? Okay, I'll make a note of that later. Secondary education in what he called that somber old college, dear old Multi, and that's the Franciscan College at Multifarnham in County Westmeath. These photos, which Pat kindly gave me, are taken from that period. They're taken in 1917, when Vincent, as he was then, was about 14 years old. After Multifarnham, Vincent, as he still was, entered the Franciscan novitiate in Killarney, and that was in 1921, the 16th of September, as you see there, 1921. So he advanced through the stages of becoming a Franciscan there. He took the first temporary vows 1 year later in 17th of September 1922. That would have been obedience, poverty, and chastity. And this culminated then, this process, in his ordination as a priest. And that was in Rome in July of 1927, the 3rd of July. And in this thing, Who Am I, he called his ordination a joy and a reward. And you can see under him there his brother, Louis Hoade, the one that also became a Franciscan. He took the name Amard, and he spent much of his life on the missions in China. Throughout these years, the years between his novitiate and his ordination, Father Eugene progressed his education. He was a very serious and a very talented student, a very talented scholar. He studied at the famous Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium, and then at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, which awarded him a doctorate in theology in 1928. And after that, he returned to Ireland. First going to Cartagena to meet his proud parents. That quote, he describes meeting them and giving them his blessing. And then after coming home and meeting everybody here, he went on to Dublin, and he was based at the Franciscan Centre in Merchants Quay. And he also read Celtic Studies in UCD during this time. Shortly afterwards, however, in December 1929, he went to Palestine. And this was at the request of the Franciscan Minister General. He asked him to assume the vice principalship of Terra Sancta College. Terra Sancta College had been opened 2 years previously by a Catholic charity operating in Jerusalem. They wanted to provide an education for children there, children of all faiths, not just Catholics. But it quickly ran into financial difficulties, and they transferred it over to the Franciscan custody. The Franciscan order had custody of the holy places in Palestine. They were made official custodians of that in 1342. So when this Catholic charity, when the college failed, they passed it over to them, and it became the Franciscan secondary school in Jerusalem. And it remained interfaith. It wasn't just for Catholics, it was for all faiths, and possibly none, I don't know. This is a picture of Father Eugene in 1930. So this is his first year. He's there in the middle as vice principal. He was the only Irishman in the college at this time. And he was subsequently promoted to principal. So he started as vice principal and ended as principal of that college. Despite an onerous workload throughout his time in Palestine, not just in Terra Sancta, but afterwards as well, he found time to keep pursuing his own scholarly interests. And he quickly became an acknowledged authority on biblical archaeology and history. And he took a great interest in contemporary life in Palestine as well, particularly in religious issues, and particularly inside that, the Christian holy places, which, as I said, the Franciscans had custody over for about 700 years at that stage. Its job really was to safeguard the holy places and to provide access to the shrines and to look after pilgrims when they came. And they also had duties towards the general Catholic population of the region. Father Eugene published prodigiously on the subjects in which he was interested in. He authored or co-authored in the region of 60 books and pamphlets. Pat has some of them there. And he also wrote numerous articles here in Ireland, as I said, in the newspapers, in Catholic journals here in Britain and in America. And he was particularly a regular contributor to the Irish Franciscan monthly Assisi. Father Eugene was also an impressive linguist. He was skilled, as you would expect for a priest, in Latin, Greek, and Italian, and he had what the Irish Franciscan historian Benignus Millet called, quote, an excellent knowledge of Italian and Arabic. And from looking at his papers, I'm pretty sure he was conversant in French as well.
And Spanish.
And Spanish, okay. He used these linguistic skills to produce English translations of religio-historical tracts, mainly pilgrim accounts of their journeys and medieval travel diaries and stuff like that. And he also wrote 11 English language textbooks for Palestine's Franciscan schools. Pat has some of them there. Because in addition to Terra Sancta, the secondary school, the Franciscans ran 41 primary schools across Palestine in the 1930s and 40s. In terms of his scholarly output, he earned an international reputation for this book, his Guide to the Holy Land. It went through 23 reprints between 1942 and 1984, and it's still very well regarded today. His peerless knowledge of the Christian shrine saw him become the tour guide of choice for visiting international dignitaries to Palestine, and he led the Irish national pilgrimages to the Holy Land, which took place during his time there. I know of two. One was in March 1930, just 3 months after he arrived, and the second was in 1935, but there may have been more. Father Eugene, he so distinguished himself in Terra Sancta. Terra Sancta flourished throughout the 1930s, and by the 1940s, it was considered one of the most prestigious schools in the entire Middle East. So he so impressed his superiors there and in the Franciscan custody more general, his duties outside of the school, that he was appointed custodian at the Basilica of the Garden of Gethsemane in 1937, December 1937. This was a very prestigious position in Palestine, and he was the first Irishman ever elevated to it. In this capacity, he became a tireless advocate, lobbyist, if you like, for Roman Catholic rights in Palestine, and he worked as an advisor to the Palestine government on that would be the British administration, on Roman Catholic affairs. 9 months later, after taking over in Gethsemane, he was appointed Roman Catholic chaplain to the British section of the Palestine Police. That was in September 1938, and this is where he kept arising in my research on the force because of this role that he had within it. So what exactly was the British section of the Palestine Police? Well, its roots lay in Britain's efforts to keep public order in Palestine in the early 1920s. Britain had conquered Palestine, taken it from the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, and its control over it was formalized in 1920 by the League of Nations under its mandate system. And this mandate was basically a legal commission given to Britain to administer Palestine, under the terms of which it was to facilitate the creation of a Jewish national home. And this obviously aroused a lot of opposition among the indigenous Arab population, and there were serious outbreaks of anti-Jewish or anti-Zionist violence in 1920 and 1921, and this forced the British to rethink the way they were policing the Palestine Mandate. Why? Because the Palestine Police in the early 1920s was made up of two sections, one Arab and one Jewish. The officers were British, and neither of these sections could be trusted to police political violence impartially. They had a tendency to, if there was an intercommunal riot, they had a tendency to weigh in on the side of their own co-religionists. So the British decided what they needed was a purely British force to try and maintain order, to put smocks really on the Arab and Jewish sections, and for use as kind of a support to them as well. So it decided in spring 1922 to create a 750-strong British striking force called the British Palestine Gendarmerie. Now, their decision to create this force coincided with the disbandment of the RIC here in Ireland after the Anglo-Irish Treaty. So they recruited this Palestine Gendarmerie largely from the RIC. Almost all of them had their roots in the RIC or the Auxiliary Division. This is a picture of them. They were recruited here and in Britain. A lot of them were British black and tans, and they were assembled in Devonport and then transferred onwards to Palestine in April 1922. So this British Gendarmerie was disbanded in 1926 as part of a reorganisation of the British garrison, and it was replaced by another force called the British section of the Palestine Police. And I'm just going to call it the Palestine Police from now on. This basically served from 1926 until the Palestine Mandate ended with the creation of the State of Israel in May of 1948. It was initially conceived as a small force, a 220-strong striking force that would be sent out in emergencies and would kind of keep order on the Arab and Jewish sections of the police. But its strength was significantly increased over the years in response to emergent threats to public security in Palestine. There were serious anti-Zionist riots in 1929. 133 Jews were killed and 116 Arabs and hundreds more wounded on both sides. So the British section of the Palestine Police was trebled in response to that, up to about 700. It was increased to about 2,800 during the Great Arab Revolt against the British Mandate, which was a serious insurgency, full-scale insurgency really, against the British Mandate by the Arabs between 1936 and 1939. And force strength of this British section was further increased during the Zionist insurgency of the 1940s, when the Zionists tried to drive the British out and create a sovereign Jewish state. So the force strength was increased to about 4,000 then. So basically my point there is that when in Father Eugene's tenure from 1938 to 1948, the force was about 3,000 to 4,000 strong. When he took up his position in 1938, the percentage of Catholics amongst this group was about 14%, but it rose as his tenure went on, especially after the Second World War, and that was due to the recruitment of significant numbers of Irishmen. I'll come back to that later. Now, being Catholic chaplain gave Father Eugene the status of a member of the Palestine Police, and he was ultimately given the rank of Honorary Deputy Superintendent of Police, which is a very high rank, and a rank he wasn't afraid to make use of when he needed to. As I said earlier, he took his duties as Catholic chaplain very, very seriously, and amongst his papers in the Irish Franciscan Archive are diaries such as this one, in which he lists all of the Catholic members of the Palestine Police, crossing out and adding names as Catholics left or were recruited into the force. Also, some of them, senior officers, had wives and children in Palestine, so they were part of his remit as well. But he also ministered to Catholic civilians working in Palestine, expats, if you like. Some of them were in private employment, like oil corporations or in shipping, but the great majority of them were working in the British colonial services in Palestine, in the administration, the legal field, medical field, agriculture, and the police. The British Army had significant numbers of Irishmen in their regiments, the regiments that were serving there then, but they had their own chaplains. What you see in the list there is a multiplicity of Irish names. You see Donlan, O'Hara, Miss Byrne, Fitzgerald, Cosgrave, and so on. And that speaks to the numbers of Irishmen, and to a lesser extent Irish women, who were working in the British colonial services in the 1930s and 40s. And Hoade, Father Eugene, was especially solicitous of the Irish Catholics to whom he ministered. He called them his special Irish charges in Palestine. Now, you might find it surprising that there were so many Irish people working in the Palestine Mandate during Father Eugene's time, because it's been something of a historical commonplace that Irish participation in the colonial services ceased when we got our independence in 1922. In fact, it continued, significant numbers continued to enlist in these services well into the era of decolonization in the 1950s and 60s. And that's because even though the political culture here was kind of reflexively anti-imperial, a lot of Irish people grasped the opportunities, the employment opportunities that the imperial services provided. For instance, the medical service, we had far too many medical schools here throughout the 19th and well into the 20th century. And that led to a huge oversupply of doctors. About 80% of doctors who qualified from Irish medical schools in the first half of the 20th century had to leave. They had to go to England or onto the colonies. So many of these ended up in Palestine. And there was also congestion in the legal profession as well. And a lot of people who qualified as barristers and solicitors and so on couldn't secure work at home. I think the legal profession was something of a closed shop at the time as well. So many of them ended up in the colonies. And because of the opportunities for employment that the colonies, the colonial services offered, if you do a roll call of Britain's ruling caste in any of the colonies in the first half of the 20th century, even after 1922, you'll find that Irish men and Irish women to a lesser extent were very well represented in every branch of that service. And this was especially true of Palestine. If you look at the colonial lists for Palestine in the 1930s and 40s, there's Irish people serving at all levels of the civil service, the judiciary. 20% of judges in Palestine in Father Eugene's time were Irish, in education, and most significantly, in the police. Why so many Irishmen in the police? Well, as I said, that British Gendarmerie, that force that was formed in 1922 and served until 1926, was recruited almost entirely from the RIC, and about 250 of that 750 were Irishmen. And that sort of started a tradition of recruitment into its successor force, which is the British section of the Palestine Police, the force to which Father Eugene was chaplain. That included large numbers of Irishmen as well. About 11% of enlistment were Irish when Father Eugene assumed the chaplaincy in 1938, and this rose significantly after the Second World War in 1946-47, when the Colonial Office launched a huge recruitment drive to recruit policemen for Palestine because of the intensifying Zionist insurgency, and about 500 Irishmen enlisted in the Palestine Police in 1946 and 1947 as a result of this campaign. This is an ad that was put up. This is like a billboard, in Britain. In Ireland, we didn't have this, but there were coupons in some magazines and there were ads in some of the papers. The Irish Press even had an ad for it, and the Irish Times as well, ads for the Palestine policemen. So in 1946, 15% of all the recruits into the Palestine Police were Irishmen, and that rose to almost 20% in 1947. So by 1947, 1948, when the mandate was terminated, about 18% of the Palestine Police were Irishmen. So Father Eugene had a large ministry, so to speak, and as I said, he took a very proactive approach to that. 3 months prior to his appointment as Catholic chaplain, the Colonial Office was urged to select strong candidates for police chaplaincy posts on the basis that, quote, weak chaplains would be worse than none at all. And they clearly heeded this advice in Father Eugene's case, because he maintained a formidable presence within the Palestine Police, admired, respected, and it has to be said, frequently feared by Catholics and indeed by non-Catholics alike. His ministry as chaplain consisted of the standard religious duties. He travelled around the police stations of Palestine, hearing confessions. He took a very energetic approach to making the less observant attend Sunday Mass. He was notorious in some quarters for that, pulling them out of bed and down to the church. And also to religious services on feast days, particularly Easter and Christmas. This is a picture again I got from Pat. Christmas 1946, Midnight Mass. This is the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And Midnight Mass there was one of the most significant calendric events in the Palestine Mandate. It was a really wonderful, ethereal kind of experience, and many non-Catholics attended it as well. That's Father Eugene is over here. I think that's John Reimer Jones, who would have been the Inspector General of the Palestine Police. They stayed in touch after Palestine. They were very good friends. I don't think he was a Catholic. Father Eugene also undertook tours of the holy places for Catholic policemen. He brought them around Jerusalem. I think that's outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I'm not sure. To Galilee, to Nazareth, Bethlehem, and elsewhere. And he also did it for non-Catholics as well. So using his knowledge of the holy places to take tours for the police around them. And they were very, very popular with the police. Every day off, if nothing else. Now, he also extended his remit as Catholic chaplain to non-religious matters. This is where it might get a little bit controversial. He was occasionally asked to persuade Catholic policemen from marrying Palestinians. The example I have here is a Constable Richard Fordham, who was 19 from Britain. And his mother, there was a Palestine police office in Victoria, in London, where people could go and, they could get recruited and stuff like that. And Richard Fordham's mother went to the police office in Victoria and asked that Richard, her son, be prevented from marrying this woman, an Arab woman in Palestine. Now, Eugene, as you can see, basically spoke to him. That these are just 2 letters out of a series, spoke to him, dissuaded him, and recommended that he be moved away from Jerusalem, wherever it was that he'd met this woman, off to somewhere else. As I said, in this case, the woman was an Arab, but he took a particularly strong stance against Palestine police marrying Jews, and I'll talk about the context for that in a while. Other interventions, he interceded with the Palestine police authorities on behalf of policemen. In this example here, this man is more or less seeking compassionate leave. He wants to get out. He's put in his resignation, but he wants to get out early. His name is Martin Hamilton. He's 24 years old at the time, a British constable from Mackmine Junction, which was between Enniscorthy and Wexford Town. He says that he needs to go home to help. He says with the farm in one letter in here, and in another then to help his father with his job. So he asks Father Eugene, can he use his influence to get him released early? And he was released a month later. So now this was towards the end of the mandate. This was in January 1948. So I don't know that Father Eugene had any influence in that, but certainly this is quite standard. There's about 6,000 Palestine police files. They used to be in Bristol, they're now at Kew, just big A3 envelopes full of correspondence to do with their service. And with the Catholic ones, you'll often find letters from Father Eugene, frequently find letters, in which he's interceding on their behalf for something, or when they're asking him to intercede on their behalf for stuff. Just another example of his interventions. This is two men facing serious reprimand for desertion, two policemen deserting from the Palestine police. And Father Eugene is writing here to the Inspector General of the Palestine Police, William Nichol Gray, basically asking for leniency in their cases. So he did the religious duties, but he also took his job mainly as a pastor, I suppose, a more pastoral role, trying to help out Palestine policemen in matters that weren't religious as such. Less edifyingly, I suppose you could say, he would appear to have used his considerable influence to lobby for promotions amongst Catholic police, particularly during the tenure of this man, Michael McConnell, who was when he was Deputy Inspector General of the Palestine Police, and that was from 1943 to 1936. McConnell was a fellow Irish Catholic. He was from Cork. He'd come out with the Palestine Gendarmerie in 1922, transferred into the British section of the Palestine Police in 1926, and risen to Deputy Inspector General by the mid-1940s. As one Deputy Police Superintendent, Jack Binsley, subsequently put it in his memoir, quote there, he said that McConnell and Father Eugene basically colluded in advancing the careers of Catholics that they liked. And that was certainly very much the view in Palestine. I heard that. I interviewed 18 former Palestine policemen, Irishmen, and I'd say at least half of them brought this up without prompting. Two of them actually named people that they said converted to Catholicism. They gave me names to convert it to Catholicism, basically to get a promotion in the Palestine police. So that was the view as well. Now, I did go through the data on promotions for Catholics in the 1940s, and there was disproportionate Catholic promotion, but it wasn't that much really, a couple of percentage points, but they were promoted disproportionate to their numbers in the force. And it was McConnell himself that made Father Eugene an honorary deputy police superintendent, which again just added more fuel to the flames on this one. Being a deputy superintendent of police allowed Father Eugene to go around armed, and he did so. He was famous in Palestine for going around with firearms concealed under his habit. And that wasn't the only respect in which he departed from the template of a typical cleric. One former Palestine policeman interviewed a man called Patrick Tynan, originally from Galway City. He was living in England when I met him. He told me, quote, Father Eugene would drink and swear with the best of us. Nor was he adverse to getting physical, to using his fists if that was required. There were rumors that he trained as a boxer in his youth. I don't know if that's true. No, that was certainly the view in Palestine. And there are several accounts by Palestine policemen of him, getting physical where it was required. And this one is from the historian of the Palestine Police, Ted Horn. I had the pleasure of interviewing him in 2009. and he told me that story that he'd actually personally seen Father Eugene removing a number of aggressively drunk Australians out of a St. Patrick's Day function in 1942. And it was actions such as these that earned him the nickname the Fighting Padre amongst the police. That's what he was known as. Now, his reputation as the Fighting Padre was greatly enhanced by rumours that he actively intervened on the side of the Arabs during the 1947-48 Arab-Israeli War, the Israeli War of Independence for the Palestinians, the Nakba. Almost all of the 18 former Irish Palestine policemen that I interviewed believed that to be true, and one of them gave me details of things he saw, a man called Pat McGrath. He died a couple of years ago. And he acted as a driver for Father Eugene in 1947 and 1948. And he gave me examples of stuff he'd actually witnessed, which showed that Father Eugene had huge authority with the Arab militias in Jerusalem at the time. So I think there's no doubt really that the rumors that he was actively involved on the Arab side are true. He dismissed them as malicious himself, but I think they were probably true. They were said in the papers in the 1950s, and then in print for the first time in 1971, this book, a best-selling account of that war, O Jerusalem. And they say there that Father Eugene trained the Jordanian Arab Legion in the use of bazookas during that war with the Zionists. And that's been acknowledged in other sources, including by members of the Arab Legion themselves since then. So I think there's no doubt that he was actively engaged in that fight. As a result of that war, the first Arab-Israeli war in 1947-48, Father Eugene found himself under the jurisdiction of Jordan. Jerusalem was divided as a result of that war, and the Garden of Gethsemane found itself in the eastern part. It's just outside the old city walls. And it had been under the border was where, when the armistice was called, they just stopped where they were, and they became the jurisdictions. So this area had been under Jordanian control when the ceasefire was declared, and it remained so as part of the peace. Terra Sancta, which Father Eugene had done so much to build up, found itself on the Israeli side, and it ended up closing and been taken over by the Hebrew University, who'd lost their premises on the eastern side. But they did open a new Terra Sancta on the Jordanian side after that. Jordan annexed East Jerusalem and the West Bank in 1950. So during Father Eugene's time there, and that remained the case until the Six-Day War, 17 years later, when Israel took the lot. Now, Father Eugene was dismayed by the outcome of the first Arab-Israeli war, particularly by the plight of the Arabs made refugees in consequence of that war, particularly in the early months of 1948. And he was involved in efforts to alleviate their distress, housing, famine and stuff like that. And he was in the thick of it, he was lobbying the Irish government and lobbying other Arab governments, trying to get money to help these. And in the years following 1948, his opposition to Israel was completely unconcealed. He made no secret of it at all. This is a conversation with the American mythologist Joseph Campbell. He visited East Jerusalem in August 1954, and he met Father Eugene, and it demonstrates the depths of Father Eugene's identification with the Arab cause and his consequent detestation of Israel. Campbell said he was, quote, very strong in his feelings for what the Jews had done to Palestine Arabs, and declared, we are at war, 6 years of it. So he completely identified with the Arab side, saw himself as one of them in terms of the conflict. His feelings were well known in Israel, and 4 months before Joseph Campbell visited him, this is in April of 1954, Father Eugene had been refused entry into the Western Israeli-held part of Jerusalem, the Western Jerusalem. He was trying to bring a group of pilgrims through the Mandelbaum Gate, which you see there, and that was the official checkpoint between the Israeli and the Jordanian sides of the city. It was Easter, and Father Eugene wanted to show the pilgrims the site of the Last Supper. That was the only significant Christian shrine that ended up on the western Israeli side. All the other ones were in the eastern Jordanian side. So he wanted to bring them into that, but he was stopped. And you'll see in the article there, he's described as suspected as an old enemy of Israel. And this is why he was stopped. And stories were abounding at that time about how he fought with the Arabs. And it was this time, because this was published in papers around the world, that he described these claims as malicious. To what then can we attribute Father Eugene's strongly pro-Arab perspective during his time in the Middle East, first in the Palestine Mandate and then subsequently in Jordan? And I think there are two factors at play here. Two things influence his thinking. And the first is his Catholic advanced nationalist roots here. You see, I think it is in this article that he's described as an old Irish rebel who had to flee Ireland during the War of Independence period. It's not in this one, it's in other ones around this time when he was stopped at the Mandelbaum Gate. Now, I don't know if Father Eugene had any involvement in the Republican campaign during the War of Independence, and he certainly didn't have to leave Ireland on that account. What I do know, though, is that members of his family were significantly involved. They were staunch and very active Republicans during the revolutionary period. In her obituary there in the Connacht Tribune, his mother Margaret was said to have ran an IRA safe house during the War of Independence, and three of his brothers, Father Eugene's brothers, were also actively involved. I think this must be true, or it wouldn't be in the Connacht Tribune, I'm assuming. And this, I think, really influenced Father Eugene's view of the political situation in Palestine from his very early years in the country, and that he saw Palestine's Arabs as the victim of a Zionist colonialist enterprise akin to which England, Britain had visited on us here. And that wasn't an uncommon view amongst the Irish in Palestine. Like the majority, certainly, of Irish Palestine policemen identified with the Arabs. They liked them as a rural, hospitable, friendly people that thought they were like the Irish themselves. And unlike Father Eugene, they didn't really think that they were capable of the advanced sort of nationalist consciousness the evolved national consciousness that would have legitimized opposition to the British mandate in the way it was justified here. But they did feel huge sympathy for what they saw going on around them. Like they intensely disliked what they saw as the manner in which the country has been taking piecemeal from them from the 1930s on, when the numbers of Jewish immigrants coming in from Europe had increased. And like Father Eugene, they saw this dispossession of the Palestinian people. They saw it as like a colonization that bore similarities, as I said, to what happened here. This was also the view of the Irish Redemptorist writer J.J.W. Murphy, Redemptorist priest who visited Palestine in 1948. In a perceptive article on the Irish in Palestine at the time, which he published in the Irish Jesuit journal Studies 2 years later in 1950, he said that, quote, "The traditional picture of Cromwell's Hell or Connacht policy in Ireland gives a fair idea of what happened in Palestine during 1948 to the Arabs whose homes were then in what is now Jewish territory." And this is basically Father Eugene's view as well. As early as February 1931, that's basically not even 2 years after his arrival in Palestine, he was denouncing Zionism as, quote, "political and acquisitive," and he blamed it for destroying the harmonious relations between Arabs and Jews, which he considered to have been the historic situation there. Zionism had destroyed that. So in my view, Father Eugene, he exemplified the way in which Irishness, a particular type of Irishness, Catholic nationalist, if you like, Catholic Republican, could inform the personal imperial experience. His understanding of and attitude towards the Zionist project was clearly conditioned by his Catholic Republican upbringing. Like he viewed Palestine, its people, and the problems, especially the problems faced by the Arabs, through an Irish national lens. The second factor, which I think informed Father Eugene's view of the situation in Palestine and his active support for the Arabs, was his attitude towards Jews, which were deeply coloured by the theological anti-Semitism that pervaded Irish Catholic thinking in the 1930s and 40s. This is pre-Vatican II stuff, that the Jews were responsible as a people even today for the crucifixion of Christ. They were a deicide nation, that they've been supplanted by Christians as heirs to the covenant with Abraham, his so-called replacement theology, that they've been the enemies of the church ever since, and we're always trying to undermine it, that the destruction of the temple, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem in 70, and the subsequent ejection of the Jews from Judea, that this was a divine punishment for their deicide and their refusal to accept Christ, and that only by atoning for their deicide through conversion to Christianity would they be able to return there as a nation again. This was standard Catholic thinking in the 1930s and 40s. And Father Eugene very much subscribed to that. He wrote, this is again from his papers in the Irish Franciscan Archive. It looks like what were notes for a sermon on the history of the Jews, written sometime in the late 1960s, certainly after the Second Vatican Council, which ended in 1965, because he seems to be very unhappy, or somewhat unhappy, with the encyclical Nostra Aetate that was promulgated in 1965 after the council, and it sought to reset Catholic-Jewish relations by rejecting a lot of what I've just said, rejecting that the Jews as a people were responsible for the crucifixion of Christ, rejecting replacement theology, and emphasizing the shared history of Judaism and Christianity. Because here Father Eugene writes that the majority of Christians have always taken it as true, collective Jewish guilt for Christ's killing, and he dismisses Nostra Aetate's ejection as watery. On the state of Israel, he also wrote that the Jewish claim to the Holy Land, like he was experiencing the gradual and then ultimate establishment of Jewish sovereignty in the Holy Land during his time in Palestine. But as far as he was concerned, the Jewish claim to the Holy Land ended in what he called the infamy of Calvary. Their exile from Judea was a God-ordained punishment, and the exile of 2,000 years, the fact that they've been dispersed from Judea, from that area, from 70 up until 1948, that this was like a vindication of Christian revelation, that their exile was proof of Christianity, if you like. He wrote in one of these documents, everybody must see in the history of the Jewish people the hand of God. And by that he meant the destruction of the temple and the exile from Jerusalem after that, and again in 135 AD. So as far as he was concerned, in the absence of conversion to Christianity, the Zionist, or the Jewish assertion of sovereignty over the region in 1948 was completely illegitimate. And that was a standard Catholic view at the time. The Catholic Herald newspaper called the establishment of Israel a corruption of the spiritual order. It was theologically wrong. And that's where he was coming from on that. Father Eugene believed that the Holy Land was, as he said, quote, the inheritance of no particular race, but belonged to the world. And he did use his considerable influence in Palestine to push for the designation of Jerusalem after the 1948 war, its designation as an international city, a corpus separatum that would be ruled by sort of an international commission, free from Israeli and indeed Jordanian control. That was strongly supported by the Vatican, and because the Vatican supported it, the Irish government did as well. This went on for years. Ireland wouldn't recognise Israel in the legal sense until 1963, and a lot of the debate on that was about the fate of the holy places and the fate of Jerusalem. Father Eugene was supported in this view that Jerusalem should be an international city by the Irish clergy in Palestine, most notably another Franciscan, Tarsicius Hand, who was lobbying the Irish government to take a proactive position on this as well. Father Eugene was such an influential voice on this that he was actually placed on a short list of candidates for the proposed post of special municipal commissioner. So if Jerusalem was established as a separate city, as an international city, that he would be the municipal commissioner. He was on a short list, I think a short list of 4 for that. So that's how influential he was on that subject. Now, in the absence of internationalism, and it became quite clear that that wasn't going to be a runner, Father Eugene, like the Vatican, would have preferred Arab sovereignty over Jerusalem than Zionist jurisdiction. And he vigorously campaigned to prevent Christian holy places coming under Zionist control. And again, he's drawing on pre-Vatican II thinking about Jews, that they're the enemies of Christianity. He says, I think in this letter, outwardly the Israelis are very anti-Christian. So he saw them as anti-Christian, and he felt that the holy places in Palestine needed protection from those. Under that aspect, there were a lot of Christian shrines destroyed or desecrated during that first Arab-Israeli war. And Father Eugene believed this to be part of an official sort of Zionist approach to the holy places to erase the Christian heritage of the city and of the Holy Land in general, and to kind of replace, this didn't fit in with their view of the region as a Jewish state. And he was the source of a lot of reports on that in the Irish papers in 1948 up until about 1950, particularly the two Catholic weeklies, the Irish Catholic and the Catholic Standard. But his hostility to Zionism was also deeply personal. So he had theological issues, he had political issues, but he also had personal issues with it. Because his anger over what, in Joseph Campbell's words, what the Jews had done to the Arabs was greatly intensified by what they had done to the Palestine police, as he saw it. J.J.W. Murphy, the Redemptorist priest who visited Palestine, said it was impossible to feel impartial between Arab and Jew when all the hostility came from the Jewish side only. And the great majority of the Palestine police were very anti-Jewish in outlook on account of this insurgency, because like the RIC here in Ireland in 1919, 1921, they were the front line. They lost a lot of men, particularly in 1947, 1948, killed. The Zionist insurgency was pretty brutal and targeted the police. In particular, they were easier targets than the army. So about 9 Irishmen died in these 2 years as well, were killed. So Father Eugene was deeply affected by those deaths, because these were his charges. He was their pastor, and a lot of them were friends. They were very young. A lot of them were 19, 20, 21. So he was very deeply affected by those deaths. So his opposition to Zionism also had this personal dimension. As I put up earlier, he told Joseph Campbell, Father Eugene told Joseph Campbell in 1954, "We are at war, 6 years of it." He said this in 1954, at war with the Zionists. And his own part in that conflict ended 2 years later. On the 6th of December 1956, Father Eugene was declared persona non grata by the Interior Ministry in Amman. He was taken under armed guard to Calandia Airport in East Jerusalem, and he was put on a flight to Beirut. Jordan cited Hoade's, quote, suspected political activities as the reason for this summary expulsion. Now, it didn't provide any more details, but rumours about these political activities have swirled since the time. Now, I twice contacted the Royal Jordanian Archives seeking access to the files on the matter, but they told me none existed, which is not credible at all, really. Considering his status in the city, there would have to be a file, unless they've been destroyed. What I can gather from other sources is that he was basically helping Palestinian militias who were shooting from the eastern side of Jerusalem into the western side. Again, some sort of military activity, small-scale attacks from East Jerusalem, sniping and so on, into Western Jerusalem, and he was somehow involved in that. And basically that's what his Franciscan confreres believed was the reason for his expulsion, and so did Rome. A senior official in Rome told the Irish ambassador to the Holy See that Father Eugene's deportation should cause no surprise. He was, after all, and this is a quote, something of a busybody who got mixed up in all sorts of matters, including political. And again, the guy that worked as his driver, the Palestine policeman interviewed, he met somebody when Father Eugene died. He died in 1972, as I'll come to. And again, it was a Franciscan who'd worked with him in Rome, and he basically said it as well. So there seems to be little doubt that he was actively involved in a military sense to some degree before 1948 and afterwards as well. Now, he does seem to have returned to the Middle East region in subsequent years. His passport is in the Franciscan archive, and there are stamps there for Beirut in 1958-59, some sort of special visa. Possible he could have gone by land back into Jordan. I really don't know. And he did act as a consultor for the Sacred Congregation of Oriental Churches in the 1960s and an advisor to the head of the Armenian Catholic Church at the Second Vatican Council. So he did maintain contacts there, and he did still do some work in that area. But basically, his expulsion from Jordan in December 1956 effectively brought to an end what was, by any metric, an extraordinary career in the region. He flew from Beirut in December 1956 to Rome. He settled first in the Irish Franciscan College, St. Isidore's, and later at St. John Lateran's. That's the Cathedral Church of the Diocese of Rome. He worked there as a penitentiary. Although the Vatican officials were, as I mentioned, rather kind of unsympathetic to him in terms of his expulsion, because they did think that he was, doing things he shouldn't have been, they still respected his expertise in Middle Eastern ecclesiastical affairs. They sought his advice and particularly used his expertise when planning the historic visit of Pope Paul VI to Israel in 1964. Father Eugene was centrally involved in the planning of that. He died on St. Patrick's Day, 1972. He felt unwell that afternoon and passed away later that night. He's just a few lines about that from somebody. There's nothing in the Franciscan archive to say what this actually is. It's just a scrap of paper. He's buried in the Irish Franciscan vault at the Campo Verano. Requiem masses were held here in Galway and in Dublin, and they drew huge congregations. You can see reports about them in the paper. The Dublin service in particular is interesting because it was attended by several Irish former Palestine policemen and colonial servants who'd known him in Palestine, including Michael McConnell. He was at it. And that's a testament to the esteem in which Father Eugene was held in Palestine during his years there. In Palestine, Father Eugene had been part of the country's imperial elite. The former Pat McGrath, the former policeman who acted as his driver, said that he fitted very well into these circles. He said he was, quote, a bit of a snob, well able to bow and scrape when required, but he insisted he didn't mean this as a criticism, that bowing and scraping was part of what he had to do to achieve what he needed to achieve for the Arab people and for Catholics in Palestine. His role as Palestine police chaplain exemplifies for me the way in which even advanced Irish nationalists, Irish Republicans, could accommodate themselves to British imperial service. To Father Eugene's mind, British rule in Palestine provided a legitimate framework for the future realization of Arab national aspirations. Part of the mandate for Palestine in 1920, these mandates, they also had one for Iraq, there were others in Africa. You were supposed to bring the indigenous people to self-determination, to bring them from their primitive state to a state in which they could govern themselves. And that applied to the Arabs equally, as well as this Jewish national home. And he saw that as a legitimate framework for that. And what he objected to was what he saw as the Zionist colonialist plot to frustrate that, which again, he saw as reminiscent of the Cromwellian disposition in Ireland, and he felt it had to be forcibly repelled. But I just want to finish by saying Father Eugene was much more than an anti-Zionist. And it's unfortunate that it's more or less, this is alone what he's remembered for in the literature. When he's remembered at all, there's very little written about him. But as I said at the outset, he was really a remarkable man, hugely accomplished, and in the words of, again, his driver, the most compassionate man I ever met. And I think he deserves to be rescued from the historical obscurity into which he has fallen here. Really outside of the local area, and very few people have ever heard of this man, who was such a huge figure and an international figure in his own right. Thanks very much.